We need to analyze the 6 psychological stages a narcissist goes through when they lose you. And I want to be perfectly clear about something before we go a single step further. The word stages implies a neat, linear, orderly progression that moves in one direction at a predictable pace. Almost nothing about a narcissist's psychology is neat, linear, orderly, or predictable. So when I use the word stages, what I actually mean is a sequence of internal experiences that the narcissist moves through. Sometimes they move through them rapidly. Sometimes it takes place over months. Sometimes they cycle back to earlier ones without any warning. Sometimes they run 2 or 3 of these stages simultaneously in a way that looks like complete chaos from the outside, but it actually has its own internal logic once you understand what is driving it. Understanding what is driving it and understanding the psychological machinery underneath the behavior you have probably already witnessed or are currently watching from a careful distance is exactly what this message is designed to give you. Here is what most content about narcissists losing people gets wrong. It focuses almost entirely on the behavior. It looks at what they do, how they act, what the hoovering looks like, what the smear campaign sounds like, and what the replacement relationship is designed to communicate. But behavior is just the surface layer. Underneath the behavior is a psychology that is far more specific, far more fragile, and far more revealing than most people ever get close enough to understand. By the end of this discussion, you are going to understand it completely. Let us begin with stage 1. Stage 1 is the one that catches almost everyone off guard because it is not what people expect the first stage to be. People expect rage, people expect immediate retaliation, immediate smear campaigns, and immediate replacement. Sometimes those things do come, but almost never first. What comes first in the immediate aftermath of losing someone, particularly someone who was a significant source of supply, is different. This is someone whose presence, attention, and emotional investment genuinely sustain the narcissist's sense of self in ways they were never fully conscious of. What comes first is something that looks from the outside almost exactly like indifference. It is a cool, composed, almost eerie calm. The narcissist goes about their life as if nothing happened. They post on social media with a casualness that seems impossible given what just occurred. They mention the ending of the relationship to mutual friends without any visible distress. They do not appear to be falling apart in any of the ways you might expect someone to fall apart when a significant relationship ends. If you are the person who left, watching this from whatever distance you have managed to create, this apparent indifference lands like a confirmation of every worst fear you carried throughout the relationship. It makes you feel like you never really mattered, that the connection was never real, and that you were replaceable before you even walked out the door. But here is what is actually happening underneath that mask of indifference. This is the part that changes everything. What looks like calm is not calm. What looks like indifference is not indifference. What you are actually watching is a narcissist's defense system activating at full capacity in response to a threat it was not fully prepared for. That defense system is called devaluation. In this first stage, devaluation is being deployed not against you, at least not yet, but internally against the significance of what just happened. The narcissist is not processing the loss. They are actively refusing the loss. They are, in real time, reconstructing their internal narrative around the ending in a way that strips it of all its weight. They are stripping you of your significance within that narrative. It reduces the relationship to something that was never as important as it appeared from the inside. At least it was not important to them. At least not in the new version they are rapidly assembling. They do this to protect themselves from having to feel what it would actually cost them to feel this loss fully. This is not a conscious process. This is not the narcissist sitting somewhere deciding to perform indifference as a deliberate strategy, though it will later become strategic. In this first stage, it is purely defensive. It is a psychological immune system responding to potential devastation with the only tool it has ever reliably had access to, which is the ability to make something feel like it matters less than it actually does. Stage 2 arrives when the devaluation stops being enough. It stops being enough at the exact moment reality begins penetrating the narrative the narcissist constructed in stage 1. This penetration usually comes from the outside world. It comes from the sudden absence of the things you provided, things they did not fully register as supply while you were actively providing them. I am not talking about the obvious supply here. I do not mean the admiration, the attention, and the emotional investment that the narcissist consciously enjoyed and consciously sought out. I am talking about the subtle supply. It is the way you laughed at something they said. It is the specific quality of your attention when they were talking. It is the fact that you knew their coffee order, their personal triggers, their history, and the particular way they needed to be handled in certain moods. This involves the intimate, detailed, irreplaceable knowledge that builds up in a long-term relationship. It quietly structures a person's daily experience in ways they never consciously catalog until it is completely gone. When that starts being absent, the shape of the days without you starts revealing all the places you used to occupy. The devaluation narrative conveniently forgot to account for those spaces. When this happens, stage 2 begins. Stage 2 is panic. It is not an expressed panic. It is almost never expressed openly because the narcissist's relationship with vulnerability is far too compromised for that. Instead, it is an internal panic. It is a sudden, disorienting awareness that the thing they dismissed as manageable is not, in fact, entirely manageable. They realize that the supply gap is real, and that the loss has dimensions they did not anticipate when they were constructing the indifference of stage 1. This is exactly where the hoovering impulse is born, though it may not be acted on immediately. The narcissist starts tracking you much more closely than their performance of indifference would suggest. They check your social media profiles with a frequency that completely contradicts everything they told themselves and everyone else about not caring. They ask mutual friends questions that are framed casually, but are actually designed to gather specific intelligence. They want to know if you are okay, if you are moving on, or if you are with someone else. They want to see if you seem like you are doing better or worse. They are not doing this out of love. They are doing this from the exact same impulse that drives someone to keep checking a physical wound. They do not do it to heal it, but to assess its depth. They want to understand how seriously they should be taking what has happened to them. What they discover in this process of monitoring, more often than not, is information that triggers stage 3 immediately and without warning. Stage 3 is rage. This rage is entirely different from the ordinary anger most people experience during relationship endings. It is different in its quality, different in its targets, and different in its specific psychological function. This is not the rage of heartbreak. It is not the rage of grief looking for somewhere to land safely. This is narcissistic injury expressed as pure aggression. It is directed outward with a precision and an energy that reveals exactly how destabilized the narcissist actually is underneath everything they have been performing since stage 1. The smear campaign that starts in this stage is not random at all. It is not disorganized. It targets the specific things about you that the narcissist knows, from years of intimate knowledge, will be most vulnerable to attack. They go after your reputation with mutual friends, your credibility in shared spaces, and the private things you trusted them with. All of those things can now be reframed, taken completely out of context, and weaponized in a new narrative. In this narrative, they are the reasonable one, and you are the ultimate problem that the relationship simply could not survive. This is the stage that the people who loved you during the relationship find most confusing. The person they are watching construct this narrative is using information and access that only exists because you trusted them in the first place. The intimacy of the relationship is being converted into ammunition for its total destruction. The cruelty of that conversion is not incidental to the process. It is the entire point. The rage of stage 3 is not about punishing you, at least not primarily. It is about restoring the narrative control that your departure threatened. You leaving, especially if you left with clarity and composure, told a specific story about who was actually the problem in that relationship. Stage 3 is the narcissist's desperate attempt to rewrite that story before it solidifies in the minds of everyone watching the situation unfold. But here is what makes stage 3 so psychologically revealing, and it is what plants the seed for everything that comes after it. The rage is entirely disproportionate. It is almost always visibly and uncomfortably disproportionate to the actual circumstances. The people watching it, even the people the narcissist is performing it for, and even the ones being recruited into the smear campaign register that disproportionality on some level, even when they do not explicitly name it. Proportionate anger looks like someone processing a painful ending. Disproportionate rage looks like someone who has been genuinely destabilized. A narcissist who is genuinely destabilized is a narcissist who cared far more than they were supposed to. They lost more than they planned to lose, and they are now burning everything in the vicinity to cover up the evidence of how much this has actually cost them. This means the rage of stage 3, as damaging as it can be to the people on its receiving end, is also the most honest communication the narcissist has produced since the relationship ended. What it is communicating underneath all of the noise and the cruelty is the depth of their internal collapse. And the narrative warfare is something they would never say out loud in any other form. It is communicating that you mattered, that this loss has real weight, and that the performance of stage 1 was exactly what it appeared to be to anyone looking closely enough, a complete performance. Now, let us look at what comes after the rage burns itself out and what the narcissist finds waiting for them when the noise finally settles. This brings us to why stages 4, 5, and 6 are the ones that actually explain why some people never fully escape this dynamic even long after they should have. That is the part of this story that we are going to dive into next. What comes after the rage burns itself out is a heavy silence that feels entirely different from the silence of stage 1. The stage 1 silence was constructed, deliberately assembled, and carefully designed as a performance of not caring. It was engineered to protect the narcissist from having to feel the full weight of what had happened. The silence after stage 3 is different because it is not constructed at all. It is simply what remains when the massive energy required to sustain the rage finally runs out and there is nothing left to replace it with. There is no next move immediately available. There is no new narrative to build, no immediate supply source to redirect toward, and no performance left in the tank. And what remains in that heavy silence is stage 4. Stage 4 is the one that nobody who has ever watched a narcissist from the outside would ever guess was happening, because it looks nothing like what it actually is. From the outside, it looks like the narcissist has finally moved on with their life. It looks like they have finally settled into the new existence they built so visibly and so aggressively in the earlier stages. It appears as though they have finally stopped caring, if they ever really started caring at all. But from the inside, in the private experience of the narcissist, in those quiet moments, they are still working very hard to avoid what is right in front of them. Stage 4 is the closest thing to genuine grief that a narcissist's psychology is capable of producing. And yet it is nothing like the grief most people know, because it is a grief that cannot be named as grief. It cannot be expressed as grief. It cannot be processed through any of the natural channels that grief normally moves through. To name it grief would be to admit that something was truly lost. And to admit that something was lost would be to admit that something actually mattered. The entire architecture of the narcissist's self-protection is built on the foundational claim that nothing and no one matters more than they choose to let matter. So the grief just sits there, unnamed and unmoving, inside a psychology that has absolutely no room for it and no tools to work with it. This produces a heavy weight that the narcissist experiences as constant irritability, as restlessness, and as a low-grade dissatisfaction with everything in their current life. They cannot trace this feeling back to its actual source because tracing it back would require an honesty they are not structurally capable of matching. This is the exact stage where the replacement relationship, if one was acquired in the earlier stages, starts showing its limitations most clearly. The new person was selected for their ability to produce immediate supply, for their constant availability, their admiration, and their willingness to occupy the role that became vacant when you left. They were not selected because they are genuinely compatible or genuinely interesting to the narcissist at a deeper level. They were not chosen because they are capable of the kind of deep knowing that the narcissist, somewhere in the unnamed grief of stage 4, is quietly aware they once had and lost with you. The new relationship produces supply, but it does not produce true sustenance. It fills the immediate gap, but it fails to fill the deeper one. And the narcissist, moving through stage 4 in the only way available to them, acts out restlessly and irritably. Without the vocabulary to explain what is wrong, they start treating the new person with a version of the same devaluation that eventually ended every previous relationship. They do this because the new person cannot fix the internal problem. And since the narcissist's psychology does not allow them to identify the problem accurately, the frustration of this unfixable problem lands squarely on the nearest available target. This is the cycle perpetuating itself all over again. This is the pattern that has been running largely unchanged across every single significant relationship the narcissist has ever had. But stage 4 has a specific quality that previous iterations of this cycle did not carry. It holds the ghost of the person who saw them clearly, moving through the background of everything they do. This presence makes the new relationship feel thinner than it should. It makes the new supply feel less sustaining than it used to, and it makes the entire performance feel slightly more effortful than it has ever felt before. Stage 5 begins when the narcissist decides to finally do something about that ghost. And what they decide to do is always some version of the exact same thing. They attempt to reestablish contact, though not always directly. Sometimes they do it through the mutual friend who has been maintained as an intelligence source since stage 2. Sometimes they do it through a social media interaction that is so precisely calibrated to seem accidental, even though the calculation behind it is visible to anyone paying close attention. Sometimes it comes through a direct message that is crafted to seem completely spontaneous and vulnerable, while actually being a very deliberate probe. They are testing whether the door is still open, whether the supply source is still accessible, and whether the clarity you left with has softened with time into something they can easily work with. This is the hoovering that was born all the way back in stage 2, finally being acted upon. It was delayed until the rage of stage 3 burned through, and until the unnamed grief of stage 4 created enough internal pressure to override the intense pride that was preventing action. The version of themselves that the narcissist presents in this re-entry attempt is almost always the stage 1 version of the relationship. It is the version that was warm, highly attentive, and extraordinarily good at making you feel chosen and deeply understood. The love bombing is fully reactivated. The charm that worked so well the first time is deployed with the exact same precision and the same apparent sincerity. To the narcissist in this specific moment, it actually does carry a version of sincerity. They genuinely want the supply back. They genuinely feel the massive absence of what you provided. That genuine wanting produces a performance of vulnerability that is almost indistinguishable from the real thing. This is especially true to someone who loved them, who knows how good it felt when it was good, and who has been doing the hard, lonely work of building a new life without them. You might not be entirely impervious to a sudden reminder of what existed before everything went wrong. This is the most dangerous moment in the entire sequence for the person on the receiving end. It is dangerous not because the narcissist is being consciously malicious in that exact second, though the impact is the same regardless of the intention behind it, but because the re-entry of stage 5 is designed to find and exploit the exact gap between your healing and your longing. It targets the gap between who you are currently becoming and who you used to be when you were with them. It targets the gap between the clarity you built in your distance from them and the deep nervous system memory of the connection that existed before the pattern fully revealed itself. And that gap in many people is very real. It exists not as a weakness and not as a failure of your healing, but as raw evidence that something genuine was felt. It proves that the love was completely real on your side, regardless of what it was on theirs. And real love does not simply close its gap on command. The narcissist in stage 5 knows this gap exists. They knew it when they were in the relationship with you, and they know it now. The re-entry is aimed directly at that opening with an accuracy that their intimate knowledge of you makes possible. It has absolutely nothing to do with their capacity for genuine, lasting change. Stage 6 is the final stage, and it is the one that takes the longest to arrive and the longest to truly understand, because it does not look like a stage at all from the outside. From the exterior, it looks like the narcissist is simply continuing their life, moving through their subsequent relationships and building the surface of an existence that appears to have absorbed and recovered from your departure as completely as everything else they have ever absorbed and recovered from. It looks, in other words, like you were completely wrong. It makes it seem like the idea that betraying you specifically would cost them something lasting was just a comforting story you told yourself, a story that the current evidence does not support. I need you to stay with me here, because this is the part that matters most of all, and it requires the most careful handling. Stage 6 is not the narcissist being fine. Stage 6 is the narcissist having integrated the loss in the only way available to their specific psychology. They do not do this by healing it. They do not do it by understanding it or by allowing it to generate the kind of genuine self-reckoning it would generate in someone with a completely different internal architecture. Instead, they do it by building entirely around it. They construct the ongoing performance of their life around an empty space that is shaped exactly like what they lost. This missing piece influences the architecture of everything around it without ever being directly acknowledged by them. It shows up clearly in the patterns of who they choose next, how those subsequent relationships unfold, and what they are always looking for at some level, even though they lack the self-awareness to name what they are actually looking for or why. This is what it truly means when people say certain relationships leave a permanent mark on even the people who cause the most severe damage within them. It does not mean that the narcissist becomes a better person, and it does not mean that they heal in any meaningful sense. What it means is that the encounter with someone who saw them completely, who felt everything fully, and who loved them with a depth and an accuracy that their psychology is not equipped to return, is also something they are not equipped to forget. That encounter becomes a permanently fixed point in their internal landscape.